I apologise. And David is now Dean and Chair of Discipline Law at the Southern Cross University. His career is peppered with advocacy for and achievements through law for groups that are often marginalised. And importantly for us today, he founded the Drive Change campaign, advocating for the need to change laws in which people are caught up in the legal system for having cannabis in their system. There was a significant ruling on this last year, and I hope he'll explain that to us because I didn't really understand it. And finally, a little bit. Rhys Cohen is a policy officer at the Penington Institute. He's completed a Masters of Research examining how policies regarding patient access to medical cannabis in Australia have changed since legalisation, and he's been involved in cannabis law reform for a long time and is very well placed to outline Penington's campaign for safe, responsible regulation of cannabis use following its 2025 Cannabis in Australia report. And I don't think we could have a better, more equipped panel to discuss cannabis law reform than we have today. So thank you all. And without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Rachel Payne. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you to everybody for having me. I too would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri, and I'm coming to you from Parliament today. I pay my deepest respects to Elders past and present, and I also acknowledge that Victoria is the first state and the only state to go through a treaty process, and how important treaty and truth-telling is to not only reconciliation but walking together as one, as Australians. So I thought today I might talk to you about, obviously being the legalised cannabis MP, I'm going to talk about cannabis. But since my time here in Parliament, I have raised the issue of cannabis prohibition and the harms that it has created time and time again. And some of the processes that we have gone through, particularly in that cannabis space, was presenting a private member's bill to decriminalise cannabis initially. So we called it the Personal Use or Regulation of Personal Use Bill, very much mirrored off the ACT example with a few changes that were added to that. Now, this government that we're dealing with the Allen Labor government, is not too keen on moving forward with cannabis reform, even though we hold a position within the crossbench that would lend to having a productive working relationship with government. However, in saying that, they have allowed more process around that particular bill. Private member's bill was then referred off to a bill inquiry. And during that inquiry, we spent some time in the ACT and looking at the ACT's experience 5 years on from decriminalisation, now 6 years on. But what that resulted in was a really productive committee response and reporting that showed that the sky had not fallen in the ACT. And we even got to meet with the police command there, and Scott Lee, as the commissioner in the ACT, outlined to us not only how cannabis decriminalisation had supported community, particularly our most vulnerable, but it also showed the appetite for police to work with public health experts and moving forward with drug harm reduction. And we know that the ACT has decriminalised all drugs, and this has been a really successful model for them in saying that. Unfortunately, the government's response to that report was that they are not willing to decriminalise cannabis in this term of Parliament. And I think that, you know, when it comes to politics, often it is all about timing. But when you have over 80% of Victorians in support of reform in this space, 80% of Victorians think that cannabis should no longer be a criminal offence. You have the Labor Party State Conference also making a position around cannabis decriminalisation and harm minimisation should be on their policy platform, and that it was unanimously supported through the union movements. What we are seeing here is a real conflict between what their membership base is saying, what the community is saying, and what the government are willing to do. So with that information, I thought, well, I had a meeting with Police Command, and it took me 3 years to get this meeting. So I thought, going into that meeting, the first thing I want to ask them is, how do we just stop arresting roughly 4,000 Victorians a year for possession of cannabis? And when I met with the Police Assistant Commissioner, he was actually it was a really engaging conversation around the fact that the police supported a harm minimisation approach, and they essentially agreed with what we were trying to propose, that cautioning should just be the go-to. Cautioning should be accessible, and there shouldn't be limitations around cautioning. So much to my surprise, and the surprise of everyone else in that room but the police, the police operations manual had been updated in September 2024 to reflect this. So in their operations manual, they had outlined that the eligibility criteria should be broadened. So unless you are currently incarcerated or on bail, there should be no reason why you would not be issued a caution rather than an arrest. They also removed the limitations on how many cautionings you can receive. So it used to be that you could receive up to 2 cautions before further instances would go forward. Now there is no limitations around cautions, and we are seeing that reflected in what the police, essentially what their policy position is around cannabis reform. But curiously, when you ask about, well, how accessible is this information? The police say, well, it's a public document. But I don't know if anyone has tried to get the police manual. It arrives like this on CD-ROM. So you are required to send in a bank check, and then they send you a hard copy via CD-ROM. Now, each time that is updated, each time the manual is updated, you are issued with a new CD-ROM. Not everyone has CD-ROM drives anymore, though, and that information, I would argue, is not greatly accessible. It is also on public record at the State Library, where, again, they have a CD-ROM that you can access and look at there. But what it pointed to for me was, well, often what we come up against when it comes to government and trying to shift the dial on criminalisation and moving to a harm minimisation approach is this conflict between government not wanting to tell police what to do, police not allowing government to have interference in police practices more broadly. However, when the police have already updated their operations manual to say this is the way that we should be operating, then I think there is warrant there to seek clarity and assurance by making cautioning the law. So in mid-May, on the 13th of May 2026, Legalised Cannabis Victoria hosted a debate around a motion calling on the government to investigate making cannabis cautioning the law. And what we were able to highlight in this debate was that the police essentially are already complying here. The police are saying that this is what they want to happen. Unfortunately, it's not mandated that they are regularly updated with what's going on in their police operations manual. Police still have discretion, and they can treat each case by case. So unfortunately, what we're seeing in the data through Crime Statistics Agency was that since September 2024 through to now, we're not really seeing a huge shift in the number of arrests in comparison to cautions. And I think when we have a little look at that, cautioning still remains at 37%, despite the updates in the Victorian Police Manual, and this was in 2024. Arrest rates for personal possession of small amounts of cannabis remain around 48 to 50% of all of those interactions with police around cannabis. And young people who are under 30, interestingly, are more likely to get a caution than be arrested, which was an interesting development we saw in that Crime Statistics Agency data. However, First Nations male men are at the highest rates of arrest to caution ratios out of every group. I think you're 8 times more likely to be arrested than receive a caution if you are Indigenous. You are 11 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than receive a caution, even worse. And so what we were able to highlight through that debate was that there is a real appetite there from the police to have that clarity. And the best option that would be approachable to government would be to say this is a really clear-cut way of allowing police to have that clarity by way of making it the law. It provides also that accessibility of information and that clarity for us as consumers. And it also means that any legal representatives in the space have access to that information as well. Because interestingly, when we raise this with all the stakeholders that we have worked with over the last few years around cannabis and arrests more broadly, and those that represent cannabis arrests or people who are arrested for cannabis possession, no one knew that this update had been made to the police manual. We even spoke to, Greg Denham, was really helpful, and Greg's on this call today, was really helpful in providing information around the initial intent of the cautioning scheme was to divert people away from the criminal justice system, particularly for lower level offences around cannabis. However, Greg wasn't aware of the changes either, as someone who actively participates or has previously actively participated with the operations manual. And speaking to current serving officers, unless they sort of scan the QR code that is around the station or around police command to see any updates, there's no requirement to be updated that information. And we know that, Victoria Police in particular are absolutely starved for time and resources. They are so understaffed that Victoria police officers don't really have the capacity to do any further education and training around what their roles and responsibilities are when there is that level of discretion that they can perform within their duties. So throughout the debate, we saw some really interesting arguments come up. And predominantly it was around the position, and this was from both government and opposition members, around the fact that, as police are moving into this harm minimisation space, then government and our policy positions around that should be also moving in that direction. And it's the first time I've seen a debate, particularly around cannabis law reform, where you've had general consensus in the room. There was still some trepidation around things like, it moved into other territories around, people being able to drive and, knowing when someone is impaired and driving. However, bringing it back to that general principle of an argument around cannabis cautioning and making cautioning the law seemed to resonate with every member across the political spectrum. What we also saw was that it highlighted to us that the fact that there hadn't been any major shift in the Crime Statistics Agency data meant that although the police had done good work here by changing their policy, it wasn't resonating through the force. And it wasn't resulting in the intent of more people receiving cautions and less people getting arrested. And, we still know that what's prevalent here is those that are getting arrested for cannabis possession are generally our most vulnerable in the community. They are people who may be sleeping rough or in between housing. They are generally people who are lower socioeconomic and working class. We also know that young people are disproportionately impacted here, as well as culturally diverse communities, particularly culturally diverse young people, and Indigenous Australians, of course. So the argument around moving to a cautioning scheme, I think most people see that as a fairly light touch, and I agree. I think that, this is not setting the bar that high that it's not achievable. And I think for us as a political party who has been in this place now nearly 4 years, it is ridiculous that we are still having these conversations around the bare minimum of seeing cannabis prohibition at nearly 100 years of failed drug policy, that we are still in a position where we're still criminalising people for possession of cannabis. However, we know that almost 40% of Australians consume cannabis, have it consumed cannabis in their lifetime, and we know that the community rhetoric is changing. It is simply about changing the rhetoric of the government. So the next steps for me in this campaign have been generally around getting the stakeholders involved. And I must give a huge shout out to everyone who is involved in behind the scenes, because it's always a huge effort to get many voices heard in this space. But when everyone is saying the same thing, that we just need that clarity with the law, that this is a bare minimum approach, and that the police are already doing this, or they indicate that this is something that they support through their policy position, then it is a no-brainer for government to step in, provide that clarity through cautioning the law. And what we should see come out of that is, unfortunately, it's not decriminalisation of cannabis more broadly, but it's pretty close to. If we can make sure that every single person who's having an interaction with a police officer around cannabis is cautioned and not arrested, then we are definitely moving in the right direction to broader reform and legislative reform and legalisation more broadly. So, as I said, next steps are to engage with stakeholders, elevate those voices, and I will be working fairly closely with government around how do we best progress this through Parliament, or are there other mechanisms we can use, whether it be further investigation. I mean, as I've already reiterated, the police are already doing this, so I don't see why there is a need for further investigation. But in a risk-averse election year government, there's definitely going to be a little bit of pushback around how best to approach that. So watch this space, and hopefully I'll be able to report some progress in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That was really, really informative. There is a quick question in the chat. I wondered if you could answer. Do all legal aid officers get updated versions of the CD?
That is a really good question. I'm not too sure. I mean, I would think they should. Interestingly, when we did put it out to Legal Aid and the Federation of Community Legal Centres and predominantly Fitzroy Legal have a lot to do with supporting people with cannabis charges. So none of them had seen this update. So unless it's flagged, I don't think people have known about it.
Interesting. Adam Wilson might be joining us from Fitzroy Legal Service in a minute. The two people who need to go at 12:30, did either of you have a question for Rachel? No.
Yeah, I had one comment and one question. Thanks, Rachel. The same thing happened when needle exchanges first came around in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. There was a police directive in their handbook, which a lot of people didn't get to know about. So what we did, we actually took copies of it and distributed around, and that was useful. So I'm wondering whether you could distribute that. So that was my question. Could you distribute the relevant piece of paper? Maybe to send it to Amanda and she can distribute. That would be great to get that.
Surely can, would love to. And more broadly, what we're working on is a campaign around knowing your rights when it comes to cautioning as well, because it's really important for our community to be able to, ask those questions if they are having interactions with a police officer, to be able to know their rights and know what they are entitled to request in those instances. Yeah.
The other one, there used to be the PCCCs, which were the police consultative committees, which were really useful. Community groups would meet with the police on a regular basis and discuss these types of issues. I don't know if those still exist because I'm not in that area of work anymore, but whether that was a viable, or something similar to that was a viable, mechanism for sort of getting this information out.
That's a really good suggestion, Simon. Can you just repeat what the name of those groups were called?
It was called the PCCC. This was in relation to needless syringe programs and that kind of thing in the early 90s. I think it was called Police Community Consultative Committee. I think I could have that wrong. It's been a while since I've said that, but yeah, it was basically around. So I was working in St Kilda at the time. It was meeting with police and talking about these types of issues. And they were a useful vehicle for that. They're not perfect like everything in our system, but something better than nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Rachel. Oh, Kevin has got a question.
And now just another comment. Actually, I'm just thinking when Paul McCartney, who's the addiction medicine advisor, he put out a thing on naloxone, and that actually was spread out, and it actually had quite a good effect. So similar thing to Simon suggesting, someone like Paul putting out something that mentions cautioning, that might get a bit of a hit, if you like. So yeah,
that'd be great. Thanks, Kevin. Great suggestion.
Who would take that up, Kevin?
Send it to me. I'll send it to Paul.
Yeah, we can do it.
Send it
We
to
can do
Simon.
it. Yeah, we can do
Send it to me.
Good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
No worries.
Good.
Cheers, people.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ah.
Better run.
See you, Simon.
See you later. Thanks again.
Rhys Cohen, who I've already introduced, and he has a presentation for us, and I'm going to hand over to him. Thank you, Rhys.
Thanks, Amanda. Hey, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon, I should say. I have a sort of a larger presentation, but given the people on this call and the other sort of talking heads that we have, I won't bother sort of stepping you through some of the minutiae. I will show you one slide in particular that I'll speak to, but just by way of context. So yes, Amanda, thanks for your introduction. And Penington Institute has been, deeply involved in the conversation around cannabis law reform and medicinal cannabis policy in Australia for some years now. Last year, our campaign to sort of legalise and regulate cannabis for adults sort of reached a crescendo. We produced, after quite considerable time, we produced the Penington Cannabis Control Plan, which is a blueprint for how Australian states and territories could actually implement the legalisation and regulation of cannabis in a way that is suitable and appropriate for the Australian context. With some, really simple and practical, policy recommendations. It's my monitor freaking out. Anyway, I'll continue as if you can hear me and see me, and hope that is true. Oh, and my sound has gone off. Something very strange is happening with my computer. Apologies, folks.
We can see and hear you.
Okay, that's great. I think Zoom just decided that right now would be the best time to update itself. So thanks, Zoom. Much appreciated. Anyway, if you're interested in that report, please check it out. It's on our website. I can recommend it to you. I'm very, very proud of it. However, over the last 12 months, I think it would be fair to say that when it comes to cannabis policy in Australia, medical cannabis policy has definitely received more attention, and there's been more movement around medical cannabis policy reform than there has been around adult use cannabis policy reform. And it's not as if those two things are completely separate. They're obviously intrinsically linked. The prescription medicinal cannabis framework in Australia is the only lawful way for Australians to access cannabis. And it'll be unsurprising to anyone here that there's good evidence to suggest that plenty of people who were previously accessing illicit cannabis are predominantly the ones who are accessing prescribed medicinal cannabis. And therefore, any changes or restrictions or reforms that are made to the medicinal cannabis framework impact not just on people who use cannabis for medical purposes, but also people who legally access regulated cannabis products for any purpose via the medicinal cannabis framework. So I just think that's important context to keep in mind. Whenever I'm thinking about or talking about medical cannabis policy, I'm always thinking about cannabis as a whole and how those things sort of interact with each other. So in case anyone was unaware, what's been going on with medicinal cannabis in the last year or so has been a really, after a couple of years of increased scrutiny on the medicinal cannabis framework, driven by very quick and significant increases in patient access to medicinal cannabis. That access has been, I think it would be fair to say, driven by cannabis companies, clinics, and other sorts of commercial businesses that have been set up to facilitate quick and easy access to medicinal cannabis as a priority, with patient care or treating medical conditions often as a secondary or tertiary priority. So that's caused a lot of concern among some of the broader community, including the healthcare professionals and doctors and nurses and whatnot. That scrutiny resulted in the Therapeutic Goods Administration last year commencing an inquiry, basically a review of Australia's whole medicinal cannabis framework. Given all of these concerns that TGA was hearing about unscrupulous business practices or potential harms being caused to patients or risks to patient health and safety and well-being, they sort of launched a root and branch kind of review of the medicinal cannabis framework, which remains ongoing. And we're waiting to hear from the TGA as to what the sort of next steps will be on that. But I'll just show you this one slide, which should give you some sort of more context here, which is this slide. So on the right-hand side, you have this figure, and this is TGA. This is data that we've accessed from the TGA. So if you're a cannabis company and you have a product in the market, you're required to report to the TGA every 6 months and tell them how many individual units of medicinal cannabis product you've sold to a patient in the previous 6 months. So a unit here is like, one jar of flour, one bottle of oil. It's one packet of medicinal cannabis, effectively. And as you'll see from the bar chart, this is the scale, this is the trajectory of increasing access that brought concerns about medicinal cannabis to the forefront. They've definitely, access has been expanding pretty much exponentially or thereabouts, for three years or so, at least, for the data set that we have. And it started to sort of slow down in terms of growth in the first half of 2025. And, we don't have enough data to say what caused that. It's probably due to a number of things. But that's definitely the time at which the media coverage around medicinal cannabis, the negative media coverage around medicinal cannabis, was increasing. And there was warnings issued by APRA and warnings issued by TGA about, to prescribers about, hey, get your house in order, you need to do things appropriately. And in August of 2025, the TGA commenced their review into the medicinal cannabis framework. So I would say, in my opinion, the media context and the political and regulatory context, the public conversation around medicinal cannabis has been, if not the only, but a significant factor in the recent significant contraction in access to medicinal cannabis. And that is concerning for a number of reasons. Of course, we know that people access medicinal cannabis to treat medical conditions, and those people we need to make sure that access for those people is not being constrained or limited in a way that would negatively impact their health and well-being. As I said at the start, the medicinal cannabis framework is also the only lawful way for adults to access regulated cannabis products. And there's no evidence that I'm aware of to suggest that overall demand in the Australian population for cannabis is decreasing. Therefore, any sudden decrease in access to prescribed regulated medical cannabis should, you would expect, correspond with an increase in people accessing illicit, unprescribed, unregulated products from the illicit market, which I would argue is not the preferred, is not good. It's not preferred. So the TGA review, as I say, is ongoing. Penington Institute made a submission to that review where we stressed how any regulatory changes that need to be made should be done cautiously. It's now clear to us that laws and regulations around patient access have not changed at all in 2025 or 2026, except for the driving law reform changes that I'm sure David will get to. But simply communicating, regulators and regulatory bodies communicating that they are watching this space and communicating to prescribers, hey, you need to be more cautious in your prescribing, or you need to be a bit more sensible in some of your business behavior. I think that is already clearly having an effect of slowing down the growth in access to medical cannabis, which tells me that the existing laws and regulations, such as they are, if they were enforced properly or enforced more rigorously, would have the desired impact that the TGA is probably looking for. And we don't need probably to make any significant changes to the laws or regulations that could have really significant sort of rubber band downstream effects. So look, I'll pause there. obviously more than happy to unpack any of those topics for further conversation during the Q&A session. But I'll leave it there and I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Rhys. Fantastic. Lots of food for thought. Maybe we will go straight on to David and come back to questions and discussion, and hopefully Rachel can still be there. So, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to talk mainly about drug driving, and you just shut me up when you've heard enough, because I can rave on about it all day. It's really interesting hearing Rachel and Rhys discuss the issues that they've been discussing. We can have all the reform that we like in the area of medicinal cannabis in terms of prescriptions. We can have all the reform that we like in terms of possession charges. But if people can't drive when they utilise cannabis, then that is prohibition by default. It will, you can get a legal prescription and you can't drive at all. You can get, you have your possession charges dealt with. I'm not saying for a moment that those aren't important issues that Rachel and Rhys have spoken about, but this is prohibition by default. It is no surprise, and it's not a coincidence, that Australia does more random THC tests than all the rest of the world combined. Every time we have some change of the law to enable a movement on the area of possession or prescription, we have increased numbers of tests at the roadside in an effort, and I would say a deliberate effort, to squash down the use of cannabis either as a medicine or as recreationally. Of course, I think that dichotomy is probably pretty old-fashioned anyway. If someone has a joint before they go to bed at night, are they really to help them sleep better or have more fun? Are they really doing it medicinally, or are they doing it recreationally, or is it a bit of both? Nevertheless, where are we at with drug driving? For the vast majority of Australians, the current law is zero tolerance. That means if you are detected with any level of THC in your system, then you are committing a criminal offence. So for everywhere except Tasmania, there is no defence whatsoever of having a prescription. That means that tens of thousands of prescription medicinal cannabis users are apprehended every year and are taken to court. In New South Wales alone, over the last 4 years, my best estimate is there's been 20,000 people brought to court for for prescription cannabis detection offences. This is absolutely ridiculous. There is no such law for barbiturates or for opioids or for benzodiazepines. This is a detection-only offence. It's the only prescription drug in Australia that is subject to this regime. Tasmania has a defence. It is a three-pronged defence. It occurred by accident. At no time did Tasmania parliamentarians decide to be the world leaders or the Australian leaders in this. It's a hangover from other prescription drugs, and here we are with Tasmania ruling the roost. The defence is that if you have a prescription and you are not adversely affected, and you aren't using any other drug other than the prescription, THC, then you have a defence when the matter goes to court for a prescription-only offence. Keep in mind, we're not talking about people who are driving while adversely affected. None of them are covered by the sorts of reforms I'm talking about. Those offences can and should continue. Next in line in terms of movement, and due to Rachel and her colleagues, is Victoria, where there is a presumption when you do get to court in favour of getting a conviction but no penalty regime. In other words, you're not disqualified. It's slightly better than New South Wales. It's had that ability, that discretion, for ever since the drug driving regime started, but it is definitely an improvement on New South Wales, but not as good as Tasmania. Next, we have New South Wales, and it only comes in third because of the proposed reforms. In close concert is probably the ACT, where, of course, as we know, possession has been decriminalised, and Rachel's research and figures support mine as well. But they haven't changed their drug driving laws. Having said that, they don't actually line up and do random testing, so they sort of win by default. In terms of numbers, because very, very few people go before the ACT Magistrates Court charged with drug driving detection offences, because presumably the ACT branch of the Federal Police have better things to do, like police domestic violence, child sexual abuse and the like, whereas in New South Wales and other states, clearly they don't. So New South Wales also has a proposal, and this proposal is in deep trouble. And in my view, the likelihood of it getting up is reducing every single day. The NRMA has opposed it from the start, despite, of course, hundreds of thousands of their members either being cannabis patients themselves or having family members or friends who are. I cannot understand the NRMA approach to this, but they are adamantly and vocally opposed. Also opposed, completely ludicrously, is a bunch of trauma doctors who are leading the campaign against these changes. I mean, we all know the research that shows that prescription medicines have a higher risk than THC does in terms of impairment. And what do we expect cannabis patients to do if they can't keep taking their cannabis? Of course, they'll go back to their other medications. But nevertheless, we have this really tragic situation where the reforms in New South Wales aren't bad, but the NRMA, doctors, and I have to say some other progressive political parties that you would think would support it are not. And it's really disappointing. Of course, this scheme is not problem-free that they're proposing. Instead of the Tasmanian or Victorian model or the ACT sort of don't do it model, in New South Wales, what they're proposing is that you register if you're a prescription cannabis patient, that you then have to do a little course involving the dangers of using cannabis while driving. And then once you're registered, provided that you have less than 50 nanograms in your saliva, then you will not be prosecuted. You will still be suspended if you have a positive test by the side of the road for 24 hours, but provided you're under 50, you won't be prosecuted or charged. Indeed, you can go over 50 3 times before you have to go to court. And if you go to court, then the similar provisions apply. You could still get a non-conviction. So in a sense, there's 4 tests. Now, the idea is, they say, that then people can go back to their doctors and vary their script so that they keep under 50 nanograms. They say that they have Monash University research that they're not releasing because it's cabinet in confidence that says that 50 nanograms is the right level that equates to affectation. There's a few problems there that we can immediately see, I'm sure. Firstly, one of the, perhaps I'm slightly cynical, but one of the impacts of cannabis use is well known to be paranoia. And so many people have been writing and saying, I'm not registering with Big Brother. But it's not quite mistaken. We've heard what Rachel said, and New South Wales is the same, that if you are an Aboriginal person, you are much less likely to be dealt with by way of cannabis cautioning. We're all aware of number plate recognition, and people are really scared that if they register, then they'll be targeted for drug driving testing, and who can blame them for having that fear? And then, of course, there's the 50 nanogram. Now, if you've got 1,000 nanograms, you get off after the 24 hours twice or 3 times. And of course, that invites the allegation that the 3 strikes is inviting people to overuse their medications. I have really grave concerns about the 50 nanograms as well, and the registration. But I'm so disappointed because this is so much better than nothing. And it's better than Victoria, and it's better than Tasmania. And yes, it needs ironing out, and there's problems, but let's get it up, and then we can kick the door into something better in the future. Jeremy Buckingham and Alex Greenwich, an independent, Jeremy Buckingham legalised cannabis, have worked so hard to get this up. But yes, as I say, it's not being supported sufficiently. And I fear the government is looking for any excuse to back down. And in particular, if the Greens don't support it, I don't think they'll even put it up. I just think they'll say, well, we need the Greens' support to pass it, so we're not going to put it up. And there we will, back to nothing with all the problems that involves. Okay, so that's where we're at. All the rest of the country, there's no movement. Western Australia, Rachel will remind me of his name, the upper house member there, he is a bulldog with this issue, and he is not going to stop fighting, and he's withdrawn all support for every government thing while to get a report released.
Dr. Brian Walker, yeah. Dr. Brian Walker it is, yeah.
Thank you, Brian Walker. So, good luck to him, but at the moment that's the state of play everywhere else. My main message is that if we don't get reform in this area, then medicinal cannabis reform, possession reform means nothing for the vast majority of people because they still need to drive. And it's a tragedy that we have that Australia has gone down a path that nowhere else in the world has gone down to such an extent, and we are left with the criminalisation of a basic need, which is for people to drive, if they possess cannabis, use cannabis, or get a prescription for cannabis. A couple of other very quick points, and that is this. I'm doing research at the moment about where places in the world have got drug law reform, and there are a few features touched on a bit by Rhys and a bit by Rachel as well. The first is the incredibly negative impact of the Murdoch press. You can almost map it throughout the United States. That the greater the influence of the Murdoch press, the less likely you are to have any drug law reform. They have opposed drug law reform within every inch of their life. Every drug law reform they have opposed. And I think that it's no coincidence that Canberra, for example, is streaking ahead because it has the least influence of the Murdoch press in Australia. The second thing is everywhere that's had drug law reform internationally has had police cooperation. And Rachel sort of made that point earlier. Without police cooperation, there is simply no chance of getting drug law reform. Interestingly, the Police Association have supported the drug driving law reform provided by the Minns government. And so that's an interesting wrap, but we'll see whether that's enough or not enough. Finally, the other impact on worldwide is the medicinal cannabis leg in the door, if you like. You don't get drug law reform without there being medicinal cannabis drug law reform in this area first. That is going to make so the fact that we have got cannabis by prescription now really does augur well, I hope, for the future of all of our campaigns. That's the final thing I wanted to say before we break is the absurdity of the cannabis industry approach to this. People are making big bucks out of medicinal cannabis, huge money. And yet the medicinal cannabis lobby is doing very little in the drug driving space because I cannot see why. I mean, I actually just don't think long term there's viability without changes to the drug driving laws. Obviously we're in the flush of a honeymoon period. Maybe Rhys would say that it's decreasing now, and so be it. But where is the industry in this? Why aren't there full-page ads supporting drug driving law reform? wherever it exists. I mean, you can see why they don't want changes to drug possession laws, because that's not part of their economic model. But when it comes to drug driving, you'd think that they'd be out there. So that's probably all I wanted to say, but I'm happy to answer questions or deal with comments as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That's provided a very fulsome picture of where things are at right now, combined with our other two speakers, and it's just wonderful. Thank you very much. There are a couple more questions in the chat that we'll get to, and then I'll see if anyone else has questions. I think it's a rhetorical question. Roadside testing is a money earner for the police.
It's a really good question. I can't speak for Victoria, Rachel may be able to, but in New South Wales, the roadside testing, the police are paid per test from road safety dollars. I don't mean the police individually. I mean, it goes to their budget bottom line. This means that money is taken from areas where there is proven road safety benefit and given to the police. And that means there's less black spot work done in terms of things like, fixing roads and corners and things like that. There's less lawful. And keep in mind that the only state, and I'm not saying this is because of their drug driving laws, but the only state that actually has a decreasing road toll at the moment is Tasmania. So we haven't seen this massive explosion of deaths and trauma on the road. But roadside testing is a money earner for police in New South Wales. There is also sort of the conspiracy theorists who say that individual police officers or the police association have shares in the testing. I've seen no evidence from that, and I've dug as deep as I can to prove it. But nevertheless, hundreds of millions of dollars over the last 10 years have been transferred from road safety to the police budget for a failed, no evidence road safety measure. The second question about self-tests available, I think this could be a revolution. I would like to see Rhys and the Penington Institute please do some research on masking. In other words, what works and what doesn't. I'm sure your bosses would approve that, but everyone says, every single cannabis user has a different story, whether it's Fisherman's Friends or apple cider vinegar or whatever rinse mouth you can do to defeat the tests, you'll do it. I'd love to see some evidence on that, because that would actually solve the problem.
It would be good. It's definitely not something Penington Institute is set up to do. But there's an additional challenge with that kind of research, because the specific model of the specific devices that these companies are contracted to supply Australian police forces are no longer supplied to researchers investigating those specific devices.
Thanks.
So there are additional, the companies that supply these devices have stopped approving requests to supply devices for that kind of testing by a third party, unfortunately.
Thank you. The other thing is, I can see a change if the self-tests become reliable enough for people to be able to drive. So someone takes their medication at 6 o'clock in the evening, then they sleep all night, and then they want to drive to work the next day. Wouldn't it be marvelous if you could take a lick stick test yourself and tell whether you could still have cannabis detected? And so there are tests available. I don't know how good they are. Maybe Rhys or Rachel does.
I mean, I'd be questionable about it. Like I said, like the specific devices that the police use, you cannot access. So you might be able to access something similar, or something that claims to be similar, or a different version of a similar device by the same company, maybe sometimes potentially. But as a consumer, definitely you are not currently able to access the identical device, and it would be very expensive for you to do that anyway, because they cost quite a bit per unit.
Yeah. I guess the other thing is that there's a lack of research on his mode of ingestion. We know that there is very low transfer from blood to saliva. So I do recommend, and Rhys, Rachel, please tell me if I'm wrong, but capsules that don't involve smoking or don't involve eating directly of the cannabis are probably less detectable than smoking or eating are. But again, there's not much research on it, and it's very hard to tell. Rhys, do you want to comment on that?
No, I couldn't possibly. But logically, I guess that makes sense. I mean, like fundamentally though, like, you know, this is the challenge that I keep coming back to is, you know, we are talking about you know, putting lipstick on a pig, so to speak, right? Like, you know, we could get saliva testing to be as accurate and sensitive as physically possible. It would still not be able to determine whether someone is impaired. You know, so like, I think personally we're barking up the wrong tree when it comes to saliva testing. But that's me, you know.
And I think it's an interesting one because you know, when I just look at more broadly some of the arguments we come up against when it comes to cannabis reform more broadly, the biggest barrier, as David identified, is always about driving and that element of road safety. And you know, I mean, I don't drink at all if I'm driving, because even just one drink I feel makes me a worse driver, even though I would be under the 0.05. So I think, you know, having that relative fits all approach is really difficult to do. But if something like this, and as David indicated, if this is a starting point and we can get some amendments to the need to report, you know, that you're a medicinal cannabis patient, I think that obviously sets off a lot of alarm bells. I would note in Victoria, you do have to report if you have ADHD, for example, and you're taking ADHD medication. That's now a requirement that you report that when you register your license. And I do wonder if it is intertwined with roadside drug testing. Yeah, just an interesting side fact. Yeah. But I think if we could get this right, for medicinal cannabis patients, this might end up opening up an opportunity for broader reform.
Thank you. Now, Adam Wilson has just jumped in from Fitzroy Legal Service. Adam, I don't know if you are present. We had a question a bit earlier about the updates to the police operations manual around cautioning and whether community legal services get access to that. Do you know?
Get access to the BPM. Sorry, I'm in a cafe. I'm just at Ringwood Magistrates Court, so that's why I had the camera turned off.
Thank you for jumping in briefly.
So yeah,
you don't know.
So no, could you just? Sorry, I heard my name, so I was quickly just turning everyone on.
Okay. Was it Rachel telling us that the police have updated their operations manual to include advice on cautioning first around people with cannabis in their system, but it's on a CD that you have to purchase. And there was a question: do all community legal services get access to this CD? And
we can, if you have to pay for it, so you have to pay the police for that. It's not much, and we do.
You do. Okay.
So yes, but look, they're not notifying us in regards to what's changed to the VPN.
No.
And it's questionable whether. Yeah, so it's up to us to kind of check it. And in fact, I wasn't aware of that until Rachel actually raised it with us. So yes, but you can get access whether.
And just correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, but I think even when they do reissue you with an updated version, they don't explicitly state what has changed in the previous version to the current version.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's a funding thing, like as far as someone actually being on top of everything that's actually changed. But anyone can have access to the VPN. Like you can ask for a subscription. And we're happy to share that as well.
Thanks. Thank you, Adam. Very timely. There's another question in the chat, and I'm not sure who it is, maybe David or anyone. Are there examples overseas where they have legalised cannabis and where they manage this conflict between driving and use? Who'd like a shot at that?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I'll jump in real quick. So, you know, cannabis has been legal for medical and adult use for longer, and more people use cannabis in North America and Canada than in Australia. Yeah. The difference is that, as David said, North Americans don't do large-scale random roadside drug tests. So if there are some jurisdictions, definitely Canada and many US states, although not all, have updated their laws to attempt to manage the new reality of legal cannabis. But it's usually determining blood nanogram per milliliter thresholds that are permitted as opposed to saliva, and that's because basically drug testing generally only occurs in the case of a serious accident, in which case they would test someone's blood for the presence of drugs and alcohol. Now, blood THC is also not correlated with impairment in the same way that saliva THC is not correlated with impairment. But it happens so much less frequently per capita because they're not doing 300,000 random roadside, saliva tests in addition to all the blood tests. You know what I mean? But what is challenging is that because cannabis sticks around in your blood for so much longer than it sticks around in your saliva, the number of people involved in serious car accidents who have the presence of THC in their blood is relatively high. And as rates of overall population cannabis use have increased in North America over the last 20 years or so, the corresponding proportion of people who have THC in their blood after a serious accident has also increased at a relatively steady rate. So some people say, well, look, the US legalized cannabis, now there's X% more cannabis impaired people getting killed in car accidents. It's actually not necessarily the case, and there's no proof that it's causal. But it's just one of the challenges of the THC molecule,
Thanks, Rhys.
And I might just add to that. From what I understand with Canada, from what we've heard, they do their impairment testing, like the sobriety test before they would ever get you to do a lick stick test. So, our police forces here just go straight to that lick stick test. They don't make you walk the line or touch your nose or recite a certain line. Which is concerning because, as we know, we only test for MDMA, THC, and methamphetamine in Victoria. In New South Wales, there's also the test for cocaine. We don't test for cocaine here in Victoria. But if someone is impaired for another reason, then surely the police should have that ability to test impairment on the roadside, and not all of them do.
That comes to... Sorry, David.
No, the T-shirt that I want everyone to wear that answers all of these questions is just like any other prescription medicine.
Exactly.
We have been using prescription medicines that have the potential to impair for many decades now. And we have systems in place that criminalize those who are adversely affected. And that's what we should do for cannabis as well. So if cannabis was treated just like any other prescription medicine, there's many more people around still who are using prescription medicines that could have impact on your driving ability than use THC still in Australia. I'm not sure if that's true of Canada or not, but in Australia it is. So we don't have detection-based testing for them, and we shouldn't for THC.
And I think that probably answers that other question in the chat of what evidence proves that cannabis-affected drivers are more dangerous than sober drivers. And I think you're saying...
They definitely are.
Yeah.
Anyone impaired on cannabis is less safe to drive than someone who is sober, absolutely. The question is, to what extent...
Are they impaired? Yeah.
And also in the context of people with a genuine medical condition who are being treated for that medical condition, does the improvement to their driving performance by having their symptoms being managed more effectively offset whatever impairing effect medical cannabis might be introducing, if there is any?
Yeah. Yeah, good point. Now, Rachel has to head off in a second. Are there any last questions for her or indeed any of our speakers? You won't get another opportunity.
You can always email me. I'm really easy to find, so please do. And thank you to everyone for your attention today, but also your very thought-provoking questions. We don't want to get to 100 years of prohibition.
We don't want to get to 101. Okay. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you at the next forum. Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have to stop the recording. There we go.